Hi, good morning. How are you all? How are you all doing? Welcome to the session 8 of Folklore and Culture Studies. My name is Abhilash. I'm a student and a Folklore and Culture Studies enthusiast, and I hope you're enjoying this journey with me. And if you do have any suggestions regarding these sessions, the comment box is open, and I'm open to suggestions and feedback as well. So without much ado, let's get started. Let's start with the progress check of where we stand. What we do is I follow the MA IGNU curriculum, and right now we are in the first section, which is folklore and culture, conceptual perspectives, under which we are in block one, folklore issues and methods, and under block one we have unit one, which is covered in the first four sessions. We are currently in Unit 2. Today is the last session of Unit 2, which is Session 8. So Session 5, 6, 7, 8 are Unit 2, uh, which is what? Let me just quickly check. The Unit 2 is brief history of folklore studies with special reference to India. That's what we are doing in Unit 2. And in the previous session, what did we cover in the previous session? In the previous session, we covered different academic approaches. So we covered three academic approaches. Number one was mythological school. Number two was the diffusion method or the migration theory. Number three was the anthropological perspectives. And there are five more perspectives or five more academic approaches, which is what we will cover today. All right. So without much ado, let's quickly hop on to the topic for the day. But before we go, I would like to let you guys know that if you guys are enjoying these videos or postcards or podcasts, or if you think these sessions are adding any value, I strongly recommend that you subscribe to these to this channel, so that every time there's a new video gets uploaded, you get a notification for that. All right. So let us quickly get started then. Give me one moment. Here we go. All right. So what do we cover today is, like I said, today's session is the second part of the different academic approaches, and we'll start with the historical geographical school. All right. Theodore Benfey's hypothesis. We already know who Theodore Benfey is in the session one. When I say session one, I mean the academic approaches part one session. We've already mentioned who Theodore Benfey is. So Theodore Benfey's hypothesis, as mentioned earlier, invoked a rigorous methodology in Finland to to study the origin and migration of folklore items. This technical method was initially experimented in the study of Finnish. What is Finnish? Finnish is related to Finland, right? For example, England, English, Finland, Finnish. So Finnish national epic Kalevala was based on the notion that as folklore forms travel from place to place, they undergo changes in form and content, yet retaining their basic recognizable features. So, what was Benfey's hypothesis? His hypothesis was that the folklore items or the folklore materials or the folklore concept traveled from one place to the other, and there was geographical routes as well. He made attempts to find out the migration routes as well, right? So he not only found out a historical origin, but he also found how the folklore tales or folklore concepts travel from one region to other region. And which is why he finds and the reason he quotes us, he says that there's a similarity between folk tales or concept of folk tales in different parts of the country because it traveled from one place to another, right? So that was his theory, and which was also experimented in the Finnish national epic, Kalevala. Right? Thus it was believed that not only the original forms of folklore items could be reconstructed, but the exact route of migration of those items could be traced through comparative exercise, which is what I said. The roots of the exact route of migration of those items could also be traced through comparative exercise. It was known as, so this method was known as the Finnish method, or the historical geographical method, because of its research along historical, the original form, and the geographical, the route of migration scales, right? So in a sense, what it means is, what does this method mean, the Finnish method or the historical geographical method or school of thought? It means that there is a commonality between the folklore or folk tales or folk materials in different places, because the origin is same, right? They claim that the origin was from India, and later on it migrated to different parts of Europe as well. And because the origin was same, we could see common characters. There's a lot of commonalities, and there is a geographical route as well, which is why it is known as the historical geographical method of school. So that's the first, first school of thought for today, right? The major exponents of this method. What's an exponent? Exponents are people who strongly believe in a particular thought or an idea. So the major exponents of this method, which method? The historical geographical method, were Karl Krohn. So Karl Krohn, C.W. Vaughan, Sido, Archer Taylor, Stith Thompson, and Axel Ulrich. Right? These were the few people who believed in this notion or believed in this idea of the historical geographical school of thoughts. And besides the precision techniques of comparative analysis of folklore data, a major development that arose out of this historical geographical method was a scientific way of breaking down folklore forms such as folk tales into identifiable traits for cross comparative analysis. Now, what does it mean? It means that they found a scientific way to identify traits or features or characteristics, okay, for cross comparative analysis. So that was one of the major development which arose because of this school of thought. Okay, further development of this practice led in the later time concept of motive in folklore texts, on which the American folklorist Stith Thompson compiles the motive index of folklore literature. This was compiled, or the basis to this compilation was the historical geographical school of thought. So that was one of the school of thoughts, or one of the academic approaches. So in other words, we can say that's the fourth academic approaches. The other three we were covered in the session 7. The other one, moving on, which is psychoanalytical school of thought. Now, let's understand what this means. The works of Austrian psychologist Sigmund Freud, 1856 1913, on the unconscious self, were highly influential in the 20th century academics. All right. For his exploration of the human mind, he extensively studied folklore materials and brought out the books like Interpretation of Dreams, Jokes and the Correlation to the Unconscious, and The Totem and the Taboo in 1913. So these are the few books he wrote, and where the folklore materials that he investigated or found out or he believed in were thoroughly used in books like these. Okay, now let's understand this psychoanalytical school a little more. So he and as many of his followers of the psychoanalytical tool used to see myths, dreams, jokes, and tales as the symbolic expressions of the unconscious human mind. So how was this school of thought different? In this school of thought, you know, Sigmund Freud and his followers believed that people see myths, dreams, jokes, and tales as the symbolic expressions of the unconscious human mind. What is the unconscious human mind? For instance, right now, right, I'm sharing this session and you are listening to me, right, and both of us are in conscious state. What is conscious? We know what we're doing, but unconscious state is where the human mind is at rest, or not, the mind is at rest, the body is at rest, but the mind works. For example, the best example for that is when we are in sleep, right? So in his interpretation of dreams, Freud drew analogies between dreams and myths, that dreams are disguised reflection of repressed desires of an individual in his or her subconscious mind, whereas myths are symbolic expressions of collective unconsciousness of a race or culture. What does that mean? In their interpretation, what the analogy that they drew was, dreams are the disguised reflection of the repressed desires. What is repressed? Something which is oppressed, or you know we are unable to express, or deep desire. It's a deep desire, or no, which is forced and kept within itself. So that's repression or oppression, right? So those are dreams. So when we dream about something, that probably goes back to the to any repressed thought which in the conscious mind is unable to express because of multiple reasons. So that is their idea of dreams. And how do they define myths? Here they say, whereas myths are the symbolic expressions of the collective unconsciousness of a race or a culture. This is wonderful, right? And probably the closest definition to myth, right? So symbolic expressions of the collective unconsciousness of a race or a culture. So firstly, let's understand symbolic expressions is, they find symbols to express, right? Symbols could be in the form of a following a particular practice, right? Or wearing something. What is a collective unconsciousness? Collective unconsciousness is where a group of people, could be a race or a culture, they are completely ignorant of a particular thing. They're completely unconscious of a particular thing. One of the examples I can quote is, from the movie, Gibson's movie Apocalypto. If you've watched that movie, there's a scene, right, where they're about to kill one of the persons, and suddenly this solar eclipse takes place, and in the day turns into night for a short while. I mean, that's how it works in a solar eclipse, right? And the whole race or the whole tribe thought this man is God, right? He has the ability to turn the day into night. So that could be an example of a collective unconsciousness. So that's what they termed as myth. As compared to dreams, dreams are a reflection of repressed or strong desires of an individual's in the subconscious mind. So this is how they differentiated. Now, C.G. Jung, another stalwart of the psychoanalytical tool, deciphered symbols of sexual drive in myths and other folk narratives, right? C.J. Jung decipher the symbols of sexual drive in myths and other folk narratives. We can find glimpses of this in different parts of India as well, right? For instance, we can find symbols of sex drive in temples, in the Sun Temple, Konark. We can find the symbols of sex drive in Khajuraho and other temples as well, right? I'm not saying this is the reason for that, but perhaps what C.J. Jung or C.J. Jung's school, or the psychoanalytical school, thought somewhere in India was also that was happening. But of course, there were other reasons behind the symbols of sexual drive in Indian temples as well. So, all right, in other folk narratives, the influence of Freudian and post-Freudian psychoanalysis was enormous, both in academic and common public values of the 20th century. So in folklore studies, it brought out radically new theoretical and methodological perspectives. So that was our psychoanalytical tool. Let's quickly move on to the third approach. When I say third, it is technically the sixth approach because we're combining these two sessions. But for easy understanding, let's call it the next school of thought, or the next academic approach, which was oral formulaic theory, right? Oral formulaic theory. Let's understand what this means. In 1930, American literary scholar Milman Parry was working on the formulaic characters of the classical epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. He extended his analysis of formulaic characters of classical epic to the Yugoslav oral poetry. His aim was to delineate the form of oral poetry and to compare it with the form of written verses. So, in essence, in simple words, what Milman Parry did, or try to do, was his idea was to connect the oral poetry and compare it with the written verses. So we had written verses as well, and there are a lot of examples of oral poetry which was not written. It was only recited, and it passed from generation to generation. So Milman Parry, what he did, or the oral formulaic theory, was his idea was to find the correlation and compare it, the oral verses to the written verses, right? So that was the American literal scholar Milman Parry, formulaic character. After Parry's death in 1935, his method was taken up by Albert P. Lord, who published his book under the title The Singer of Tales in 1935. With his seminal methodology, he closely observed the unlettered oral poetry being performed or sung without reading or writing. Right. So his strong observation was that the oral poetry, it was recited without being sung, well, without, or sorry, it was performed a song without reading or writing. So no one was referring to any material and then singing and performing, right? They memorized. So that was his strong observation. From That was his observation. It was observed that epic singers memorize a set of formulas which enable them to carry on the traditional themes with reasonable accuracy, and at the same time give freedom to improvise new elements depending on the occasion without altering the form drastically, right? So what does it mean? It means that singers memorize a set of formulas. So they would memorize a set of formulas, either perhaps a rhythm or rhyming words, right, which will enable them to carry on the traditional themes with reasonable accuracy, which means the words would the meanings wouldn't change, the words would remain almost the same, and at the same time there was an element to improvisation as well, to improvise some, to add a new elements depending on the occasion without altering the form drastically. So that was his observation, and the work of Parry and Lord remained influential in succeeding folklore scholarships. So their work remained influential in other people who studied folklores. Their work remained influential. Besides imparting useful perspectives on narrative composition of oral poetry, it also initiated the trend in folklore studies to take folklore forms more than text, to take it as folklore forms more than text. For example, the performance or singing dimension in their case of oral epics. Now, this is interesting, and this is one of the important things. So, the work of Parry and Lord, what did it do? Is of course, it gave a useful perspective on the narrative composition, right? The way we narrate. So it gave a useful perspective to that. That's number one. The which initiated point number two is initiated the trend. So until that, the trend in folklore studies was only the written texts were a part of the folklore forms. But after their study, the oral texts, for example, the singing, the performance poetry, which was not written but was only performed, also started to become a part of the folklore form. So that was Parry and who was the other one? Albert B. Lord's major contribution to folklore. All right. So an important thing to be noted during the time of Parry and Lord's book, that is the 1930 in the 1930s, the Russian formalist V.J. Prop was also working on similar lines. So VJ Prop in Russia was also working on similar lines, though Prop's work was on folk tales, not on oral poetry. So VJ Prop was also working on something similar, but his work his work was mostly on the oral tales of stories, not poetries. On the other hand, Parry and Lord's work were mostly on oral poetries, and Prop's work was on narrative tales. So that was a difference, but more or less both of them worked on finding out the perspective of the oral narratives, and both the works were attempts to decipher the characteristics of narrative composition of folklore form. So both of their works, when we say both, who's, so Parry and Lord was one and VJ Prop was the other person, and both of their works attempts to decipher the characteristics, so the features of the narrative composition, the formula behind it, how, without they're referring to any notes or without writing, how they could perform. So that was, both of them worked on that, and that makes it our oral formulaic theory. So with this, let's move on to the next academic approach, which is the structural school. Let's understand what structuralism is. Structuralism is an approach in which any field or object of study is treated as a system of unrelated parts. Okay. It was a popular and widely accepted perspective in several academic fields of the 20th century. So this was, this methodology or structure was not only used in folklore, but it was also used in other academic fields as well. So in folklore studies, the seed of structural analysis was planted by Vladimir J. Prop. So VJ Prop, right? His name is Vladimir J. Prop. So he planted the seeds of the structural analysis around from 1895 so and 1970. That was his duration. The Russian formalist published his book Morphologia Skazia in Russian language. I hope I pronounced it right. In 1928, we translated into English in 1958 as a morphology of folk tale. In that remarkable book, Prop took an entirely new synchronic approach to the study of Russian folk tales. Let's understand a little more. Instead of the meanings of folk tale, Prop analyzed their structural form. So how was VJ Prop's work was different? If you notice, the previous scholars, they tried to find out the meaning of folktale, but what Prop instead did was he analyzed their structural forms, components, parts of the structures, and the interrelation amongst them. Regarding the issue of similarities of folktales of different places, he was interested he was interested neither in finding their origin of these similarities nor in random comparison or classification of their similar traits of tales. So this is how he is different from Theodore Benfey, right? If you remember Theodore Benfey, his the historic geographic approach where they try to find out the similarity, their origin, how the, also the migration theory talks about that as well. But in this theory, the structural approach, structural school, particularly VJ Prop, was not interested in finding the similarities or comparing them randomly, right? Instead, they focused on the components or parts and the structures. He showed that vital components of a folk tale are not its characters, right, but certain actions of the characters. For example, again, let me quote Theodore Benfey here. So Theodore Benfey theory believed that, in because of the common origin, although folk tales in in different parts of the country or different parts of the world, the characters were more or less same, is what Benfey said in his school of thoughts. But in structural school of thoughts, what Prop says is, it's not because of the characters, it's just because of the actions of those characters, right? which are found to be constant in folk tales in different places. So the actions of these characters, irrespective of whichever part the folk tales originate from, the actions are constant, and which is what which is why there is a common thing. Now that was his approach. The presence of such constant actions, which he called functions, which Prop calls functions, are responsible for the similarities between different folk tales. This is interesting, right? Look at it. It's the same thing. It's the same thing, right? But how different people look, share the different perspectives. They both of them, Benfi and Prop, both of them, they're talking about the same thing, right? Same thing, that the characters are the same, right? But the way Benfi looks at it is very different from the way Prop looks at it, and which is why this study is so interesting. So that's that. And then we also have Claude Lévi-Strauss. The Claude Lévi-Strauss was an extraordinarily versatile French anthropologist, who turned to be a structuralist later, led another structuralist approach for the study of folklore forms. Let's understand that. Strauss, who applied his structural formulations to explain myth, kinship, and visual arts, followed complex interpretation schemes which he built on the concepts of Saussurian linguistics. Unlike Prop, Strauss did not separate the form and content, and the meaning. So he did not separate the form and the content. For example, Prop or structuralism, they focus on the structure, right? But other folklorists, they focus on the meaning and the content. But Strauss did not separate these. He treated myth as a higher and a complex level of communication carrying mythic messages. So that was his thought. And the last thought that we have, or the last academic approach that we have, is the contextual theory. Let's understand that. Towards the late 20th century, along with the radical changes and developments in the academic and intellectual fields, American scholars like Roger Abrahams, Dan Ben Amos, Alan Dundas we've already studied, Kenneth Goldstein, Robert Gorges, began to take folklore items within multidimensional frameworks. They stopped looking at folklore from a one direction. They looked at folklore as from a multiple direction. That's what it means. In this enlightened approach, the items of folklore began to be seen not merely as texts, but as events, where the context of folk performances like storytelling, singing, rituals, festivals, and conversations was regarded as important as text, and which is what adds different levels or different layers or different dimensions here, right? So until then, it was only written text or written verses which was considered to be a part of folklore. But with this multi-dimensional approach, storytelling, singing, rituals, festivals, conversations, all of these were regarded as important as texts as well. However, the root of such outlook can be seen in the works of Parry and Lord. Parry and Lord, they initiated the oral formulaic theory, where this importance was started to given to the oral forms, the poetry forms, right? The root was there, but with the contextual theory, it became even more popular. Uh, Whereas attention was given to the contextual data of oral epic singing. The forms of such contextualists involve comprehensive field work for holistic recording of these folklore events, in contrast to the text-oriented exercises of earlier scholars, shifting attention more to feel than to the library, right? So with this approach, what happened was, I've already said, multiple dimensions got added, and people started moving on from texts, meaning people started moving on from reading to recording those events. What are those events? They started recording festivals, they started recording rituals. So eventually people, these folklorists moved from the library to the field. So that was one more academic approach, which was the contextual theory. So, with this, we are done for today's session. So, in this is academic session. So, this was academic session part two, and part one we've covered three schools of thoughts, and today we've covered five schools of thoughts. And with this, we also come to an end of the unit two. Unit two, which was let me quickly refer to my notes, which was brief history of folklore studies with special reference to India. Uh, with this, we've come to an end of this unit. And sorry, not end of this unit. We've come to the end of this academic approaches. We have, of course, we haven't started the brief reference of India. We will cover that in future sessions as well. But I hope you are liking these lectures. If you do like these sessions, I recommend that you subscribe and hit the like button, and I'm open to suggestions and feedback as well. If you do have any other thoughts, do share. You can send an email to folkloreandculture@gmail.com, or the comment box is open for that. All right, do have a nice weekend, and I will see you soon in the next session.